Shabbat Shalom, Oliver, and Yashikoach. Beautiful, powerful Dvar Torah. Thank you. I have the opportunity now to respond to both Oliver and Lila. And wow, Lila and Oliver, I am so proud of you. I am so impressed with each of you in the way that you read Torah and Haftarah, and the way that you taught us this morning. You added your voices to Torah today, becoming our teachers while showing us a new facet of Torah that we may never have seen before. Lila, you showed us that in this parasha, women, Sarai and Hagar, were seen as not much more than vessels for reproduction and appendages to men. They were identified and defined by their relationship to men and their ability to birth children. And they were not given a voice in the text by the authors of the Torah. But you asserted this constricted definition of women's lives was not God's design or attitude. It was a limitation of the men of their generation and the men of Torah, the authors of the text. Whereas in both the text itself and in the Midrash, we see God listening directly to the voices of women. We see a God determined to hear women's voices and redeem them from their oppression. You could not have given us a more timely message this week. Oliver, you then showed us that the covenant of circumcision, the defining mark of the Jewish people's relationship with and commitment to God, cannot and should not be seen as the all-encompassing symbol of Jewish peoplehood or of covenant, because it excludes all Jewish women and the Jewish men who are not so marked. You did not argue that we abandon this right, just that we expand the definition of covenant and covenantal ritual to include those currently excluded. It's as if you were coordinated, the two of you, as if you, Oliver, were taking Lila's critique of the Torah and applying it to our practices today, imagining a world where Jews enact an expanded definition of peoplehood and covenant, one which fundamentally includes all genders and bodies and lifts up the voices of women. Oliver, you mentioned briefly a transformation that takes place within Avram and Sarai during the part of the portion upon which you focused. Just as they are entering the covenant with God, God changes their names, adding a letter He to both names, making them no longer Avram and Sarai, but Avraham and Sarah. The commentator Rabbi Bachya suggests that the two new He's in their names come from the Yud in Sarai's name, that God trades out the Yud, which is the 10th letter in the Aleph Bet, and therefore has the value of the number 10, with two He's, the 5th letter of the Aleph Bet, that have the number 5. So 5 plus 5 is 10. Giving one He to Avram and one He to Sarai. And these He's, Rabbeinu Bachya says, are the last letter in God's 4-letter name, Yud He Vav He. And this divine inclusion in them that they now embody is what gives Abraham and Sarah the strength to have a child in their old age. That is why the name change is explained as it is in the Torah. You shall no longer be Avram, but your name will be Avraham, for I make you the father of a multitude of nations. I want us to pause to think about the anxiety that God is addressing in Abraham and Sarah with this move. They left everything they knew, their families, their homes, their country, everything familiar, to go to an entirely new place they'd never seen before. God promised that they would parent a new people, that they would establish an entirely new way of life. But when they arrive in the promised land, there is not food or water with which to survive. Lila, you are right about Abraham's behavior towards Sarah. But let's also remember the heightened state of fear that they were in, totally unprotected as travelers into Pharaoh's land, subject to violence, unlikely to emerge intact or at all. After they do survive, they continue to lack any actual evidence that they are on the right path, that the promise will be fulfilled. They travel from place to place, unable to figure out where to settle, getting into a land dispute with Abraham's nephew Lot, and then getting caught up in a war, violence among all of the surrounding kings. Finally, here they are, old and without children. Abraham is 99 years old. He left his home a lifetime ago to listen to the voice of God, and now he has to be asking himself if it was all a mistake. Because he has no children, and the nation that he was promised now seems impossible. He says, What can you give me to God, seeing that I will die childless? God's blessing, God's hey in Abraham and Sarah's names is divine reassurance that no matter how uncertain their world is, no matter how bleak their world seems, no matter how anxious and worried they are about their future, they are never alone. They are bearers of God's name and God's blessing. God, the source of truth and justice, God, the force for redemption of the world, is in permanent partnership with them and with their descendants. This matters to us today, on this particular Shabbat. I cannot remember a Shabbat when our country felt more anxious, more worried about what the future would hold. I cannot remember a Shabbat when we needed more reassurance that we are part of something larger, a movement toward redemption, a journey to a messianic age in which the world will be characterized by the true and the just and the good and the right. That is the message of this parasha, that the arc of the moral universe is longer than any of us would ever like it to be, but it does bend toward justice. That is not only what this portion is about, but that is what Judaism is about. The idea that history has a direction and it moves toward redemption, toward love and goodness and righteousness and freedom. We have to stop and think about what Abraham's and Sarah's great going forth, Lech Lecha, was actually about. What did it mean to refuse to bow down to idols? It meant that they refused to bow down to power. They refused to worship power. They refused to be part of a world where might makes right, where truth and goodness and justice are irrelevant because all that matters is power. Idol worship is not primarily about whether we pray to little statues that represent gods. It's about what those statues represent, the gods that they're pointing to. That those gods were capricious and were constantly in battle with one another for power. That's what Ra was for the Egyptians, and Baal for the Canaanites, and Zeus for the Greeks. Power. Instead, Abraham and Sarah heard a call that they could create a different kind of human reality, in which the power they worship is the force of truth and good, of justice and right. A God that uses power to listen to the voice of the oppressed, as we say about our God over and over and over again. The God that listens to the stranger and redeems the widow and the orphan. A God that values every human life with loving kindness and with compassion. That is what we assert about the God we worship. A God loyal to truth above all else. Loyal to truth above power. When they followed that voice, they affirmed that such a world could be real. Right now, in this country, we are witnessing a mass expansion of consciousness in our generation, an expansion of consciousness that cannot be undone. We are able to see and say things about our country that we never could before, with language and awareness we did not have even 4 years ago. This latest spurt in our growth comes after decades of a sea change, a change that, by the way, Lila and Oliver, you represent, a change in attitudes about women's lives and LGBT lives and race and racism in America and our relationship with the earth. We are in the midst of a huge transformation in human consciousness, and we are witnessing a backlash to that forward sprint, the contraction in response to the expansion. We do not know what will happen this week, or next month, or in January. But we do know, without a doubt, that we are the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, that in our time of greatest anxiety and uncertainty, when the world seems bleak, we have God's name nestled inside of us. We are called continuously to truth and justice and goodness and right. We are part of that great arc of the moral universe that is bending, always bending toward justice. As Michelle Alexander reminded us in 2018, none of us are resistance. Let us not call ourselves that. We are the river. Quoting Vincent Harding, a great voice and historian of the Black freedom struggle, who wrote, "The long, continuous yearning and reaching toward freedom flows throughout history like a river, sometimes powerful, tumultuous, and roiling with life, at other times meandering and turgid, covered with the ice and snow of seemingly endless winters, but always flowing. All the same, the river cannot be stopped. Human consciousness, human evolution cannot be stopped. Whatever happens this week and over the next months, this we know is true. The river is unstoppable and we are part of it. The Hay of Yud Hey Vav Hey, the ineffable one, is flowing through us. Nonetheless, these next few weeks and months may be precarious and dangerous times in our country. And so we pray. God of the fearful and the anxious, God who accompanied our ancestors Abraham and Sarah on their journeys through the unknown, God who amplified the voices of the poor and the oppressed through our prophets, God who weighs every human life with loving kindness, inspire us to make our voices heard. Give the people of this land the courage and the safety to cast their ballots in peace. Protect the volunteers, the poll watchers, the poll workers, and the voters. Guard our streets from violence. Guard each human life, each reflection of your image as the process of our democracy unfolds. Spread your shelter of peace over our country, that we may have a clear and peaceful outcome to our election. Heal the wounds and the divisions in our land so that we can see one another afresh and begin the work of building our future together. Ken Yiratzon. Shabbat Shalom.